Today, I wanted to look back at my favorite wood, steel, and overall coaster as it changed with time. I thought that would be a pretty interesting thing to do. In 1994, I rode my first ever roller coaster in Rudy's Rapid Transit Coaster at Santa's Village, so by default it became my favorite roller coaster. The other rides I rode in 1994 and 1995 couldn't top it. I just wasn't impressed by Storyland's Polar Coaster or the kiddie coasters at local carnivals. In 1996, I rode Canobie Lake Park's Galaxi and it became my new number one. And it would stay at that spot for 2 years. It was easily the biggest coaster I had ridden to that point. Ironically, this would actually be the only visit where I ever saw the Galaxi running. In 1998, I visited Walt Disney World for the first time and fell in love with Space Mountain. It took my top spot. This was my first encounter with airtime, and I immediately fell in love with the holy grail of coaster sensations. Space Mountain stayed at that top spot until we returned to Disney World in 2000. By that point, I had hit the magical 48-inch mark. That allowed me to ride all the adult coasters now. Specifically, at this visit, Rock and Roller Coaster. Rock and Roller Coaster was not only my first looping coaster, but it was also my first launched coaster. That resulted in an unforgettable experience. It immediately became my new favorite coaster. Rock and Roller Coaster would remain my favorite steel coaster until 2005, but it didn't remain my favorite overall coaster for long. In 2000, I also rode my first wooden coasters. My first one was Yankee Cannonball. It couldn't top Rock and Roller Coaster, but later that summer I rode something that did. The Great Escapes Comet. The Comet was my favorite coaster until the summer of 2005. I loved the double out and back layout with all that airtime. Then in 2005, my family went on a road trip through Pennsylvania. Our first stop was Hersheypark, and I found a new favorite steel coaster in Great Bear. This was my first B&M, and I loved how smooth and forceful it was. The next day we went to Canoble's, and I found a new favorite overall coaster in the Phoenix. It was a better version of the Comet. I could not believe how much airtime that ride delivered. Phoenix would be my favorite wooden coaster until 2010. But it wasn't my favorite overall coaster for long. The following day took us to Dorney Park. There, I rode my first hypercoaster in Steel Force. Looking back, it's pretty funny this used to be my favorite coaster in the world. Since it was my first hypercoaster, I was blown away by the ride's height and speed. I hadn't ridden anything like it to that point. Steel Force spent 1 year as my top coaster until I rode Apollo's Chariot in 2006. Apollo's Chariot had better airtime and far more open restraints. Apollo's Chariot stayed at my top spot until the summer of 2010 when I rode Behemoth at Canada's Wonderland. This was my second B&M Hyper, and it was a better version of Apollo's Chariot. The amount of sustained airtime was incredible. That's why it was my favorite coaster until 2012. In 2010, I also found a new favorite wooden coaster in El Toro, and it would hold on to that spot until 2012. I find it funny looking back that my favorite ride at Great Adventure in this visit was actually Nitro, but at that point, I preferred the sustained floater airtime over more aggressive ejector airtime. Eventually, my tastes changed, and in 2012, I found a new number one in Skyrush. I was blown away by the sheer amount of sustained ejector airtime. A month later, I found a wooden coaster I liked more than El Toro, and that would be none other than the recently retracted Coney Island Cyclone. I was blown away just how much airtime that old coaster had in the back row with such a minimalistic lap bar. It would remain my favorite coaster until 2015. 2015 was the year I rode my first RMC in Wicked Cyclone. Now, I'm pretty sure whatever RMC I rode first would have immediately become my favorite roller coaster at that point in time, because I hadn't ridden anything with aggressive pacing like that and all the airtime together. Later that fall, I got some amazing night rides in Boulder Dash during Haunted Graveyard. They weren't enough to top Wicked Cyclone, but they were enough to top the Coney Island Cyclone as my favorite wood coaster. Boulder Dash would hold on to that top wooden spot until 2017. In 2016, Wicked Cyclone was topped by B&M's Giga Coaster, Fury 325. I was blown away by the sustained airtime on the drop and return run, combined with the blistering speed and quick maneuvers of the first half. Fury 325 would hold the top spot until I rode Iron Rattler a year later in 2017. Iron Rattler's setting and insane drops off the quarry made it my new favorite coaster. That same summer, Phoenix vaulted over Boulder Dash as my favorite wooden coaster. The more coasters I rode, the more I realized just how special it was to have a coaster with as little restraints as Phoenix and that much airtime. That fall, I went to Europe for the first time and found a new favorite coaster in Expedition GeForce. The sustained ejector airtime combined with those minimalistic T-bar restraints was perfect. But in December of 2017, I finally conquered my white whale. I finally rode Lightning Rod. That coaster had been closed my first 3 times at Dollywood, and it sat there teasing me. But eventually I was able to ride Lightning Rod, and it immediately became my favorite roller coaster, and it still is. The speed, airtime, and setting cannot be topped. Expedition GeForce was topped by another steel coaster in 2018 once I rode Steel Vengeance. But as good as Steel Vengeance was, it couldn't top Lightning Rod. So that's the history of my favorite wood and steel coasters. I'm hoping something else comes along that can dethrone my champions currently, but we'll see what happens. What's your favorite coaster? I'd love to hear your comments down below, and stay tuned for more coaster videos here at Canobie Coaster.